Good evening, everyone. Good evening. It's good to see you all here this evening. My name is Jim Oliver. I'm the provost here at the Seminole Campus, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to St. Petersburg College, and specifically to the Seminole Campus of St. Petersburg College. Some of you may have been in this room in the past. We have folks who have been in this room in the past. You may have noticed that there's been some changes to this room since you were here last time. We had some considerable feedback from the group about the acoustics in this room and about the sound system. So this fall we've done a bit of remodeling so that the video and the audio is crystal clear for you to hear and see, to add to the quality of our programs. And we added a little bit of decor along with it to give it more of a living room feel, so we could have that kind of important discussion that is entailed in this kind of event. We're delighted to be able to host a program of this significance in the discussion of the national debt on campus, and to be able to engage so many folks here in the community. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you the Executive Director of the Institute for Strategic Policy Solutions, which is bringing you this event, sponsored by, and we thank our sponsors, the St. Petersburg Times, Bright House Networks, and W.U.S.A. The Executive Director of the Institute is our own Dr. David Clement, to get the program underway. David.
Thank you, Dr. Oliver, and I realize that some people are going to be coming in as we continue, but we want to respect your time and everyone's time and get as much in as possible. The storm has created traffic accidents that has slowed some people probably getting here, but we will do the best we can. Nature seldom seems to cooperate, does she? And I want to add my welcome to all of you for coming, and thank you for coming, and to reiterate what Dr. Oliver said about the new acoustics in the room, and to thank the staff for their hard work in making it possible. It has been a job, because a room this size is not easy to get the right acoustics, and I think we have come close to that. And I want to also reiterate my thanks to the co-sponsors who gave us such good publicity to let you all know about this event, the St. Pete Times, WSF, Radio, and Bright House. We appreciate their cooperation and support of the work that we do, and if I could ask you for a round of applause for them, please. And I know that many of you will have questions. We're going to ask you to put them in writing. Our staff will pass through and have cards available. If you want to get one, raise your hand as you see them. I believe they're yellow in color as we go along, so just indicate that. Now, I want to just talk about a little bit of the program before I introduce our speaker. It's good to see that so many of you turned out to learn more about the national debt, and I think that there is no issue in our country that's more important. And that includes the economy and jobs, because as to my understanding of this, what you're about to see, that our national debt threatens everything. It threatens the economy, education, even our national defense, if we don't do something about it. And I know that sounds gloom and doomy, and it is. Those of us who haven't lost our sense of irony realize that this is the 70th anniversary of Pearl Harbor Day, and we also know that if we don't do something about the debt, we're heading for yet another day that will live in infamy if our country doesn't get its debt under control. The good news, as I started to say, is that the crisis is solvable. And that's what this program is about, to let you know that it's not hopeless, despite what we may think and from what we hear on the media, the talk shows. There are solutions, and they're fairly simple. They don't involve extreme pain, just some sensible fixes, some old-fashioned virtue of shared sacrifice, and political courage. Much of which, of all of those, we haven't seen enough of in Washington lately. When I first heard about this documentary, I was not really excited. I thought it would be boring. But as I watched it, this was 3 years ago, I really got excited because, as you're going to see, it puts this complex and sometimes mind-numbing statistics and fiscal processes into a format that is easily understood. That's easy. If I can understand it, any person of normal intelligence should be able to, because I am math challenged myself. And now I guess it's time for me to bring on our speaker. Dr. Gordon, Joshua Gordon, must feel right at home, because as you may have read or heard, he grew up here in Seminole. He graduated from St. Petersburg High and attended the University of Florida. I know there are at least a couple of former teachers, classmates, friends, and relatives here in the audience who remember him from his Seminole days. We were fortunate to connect with him through the Concord Coalition, where he is policy director and heads up the research for that organization in Washington on the federal budget, healthcare policy, and tax policy. You may have seen him being interviewed in the media, national media, if you watch talk shows, because he's a frequently sought out resource for the news media. And you can read his complete biography in your program. So without further delay, I will introduce Dr. Gordon, who will set the stage for the video.
Okay, so this is quite the homecoming. Walking in, I see the big paintings of Congressman Young in his office here. And I actually had my first job as a 9th grader in high school in Congressman Young's office. I was an intern. I took the bus there, and that was my first experience with the political system. And, you know, I learned about constituent service and answering letters and how to do all that. But I also occasionally got to answer the phone, and someone would want to talk about policy with me. They didn't realize I was just a 9th grader, and it was fun to learn my way through it that way, and that's still really the thing I enjoy the most. So after the movie, I look forward to talking with you and having a conversation about this really important issue. I want to thank David for bringing me here. Provost Oliver, thank you very much. The sponsors, I want to thank them as well. And so what we're going to see is a 30 to 40 minute movie. And the way this movie came about was in 2005, my organization started something called the Fiscal Wake-Up Tour, where we went around the country to all the cities that would have us, really, to bring think tank members from the left of the political spectrum, from the right of the political spectrum, and the Comptroller General of the United States at that time, David Walker, who was the nation's chief accountant. And the idea was to take this roadshow around the country and really show the American public that the importance of this fiscal challenge is not an issue that concerns only those on the left or only those on the right, and that there's actual unanimity inside the Beltway that this is a huge problem. Now, how we solve the problem is something that there is a bit of a dispute about, but there really isn't any dispute about the numbers. And so the goal was really to present these numbers in a way that people would feel comfortable that they were hearing this from an honest source and begin to get upset about it and want to learn more. And then in about 2007, a documentary filmmaker heard about this and followed the wake-up tour around and made really what was a buddy comedy, in a way, about this roadshow that actually got into the Sundance Film Festival and then premiered across the country in August of 2008. So this was actually right before the recession and the financial crisis. So it didn't take very long for that movie to get out of date, because we had this really dramatic shift in the talk in the country, the size of budget deficits, and certainly the state of the economy. So what the owners of the film did afterwards was update it with new numbers, taking into consideration the economic crisis, and put out a 40-minute version that's really more of an educational version, not so much the buddy comedy, but still very important and very easy to understand the numbers and the challenges. So that's what you'll see, and afterwards I'll update even further some of the numbers just to give you a sense of where we stand now and give you some perspective on what just happened with this super committee and their failure to reach an agreement. So I look forward to talking to you about that, and I'll see you in about 35 minutes or so. Thanks.
In the fall of 2008, the critically acclaimed documentary film, I.O.U.S.A, was released in theaters nationwide. The film warned of America's rapidly growing national debt and its implications for the country. No one could have predicted how much worse the situation would become in just 19 months. Consider these facts. In 2008, our federal budget deficit, which is how much money the U.S. government needed to borrow to pay all its bills, rose dramatically to $459 billion. Last year, due to extraordinary economic conditions, our budget deficit exploded to $1.4 trillion. That's over $4,500 for every American. And the total projected deficit over the coming decade will be $16 trillion. What about the national debt? In September of 2008, the national debt was $9.6 trillion. Today, it's almost $12.7 trillion, a 32% increase. That's nearly $41,000 for every American. And our budget deficits and national debt are only part of the problem. If you were to add up all of our nation's total liabilities and unfunded promises in Social Security, Medicare, and other programs, you would get over $62 trillion, $6 trillion more than in the fall of 2008. This is how much money our federal government would need invested today to pay for our nation's major liabilities and promises. How much of this $62 trillion do we have today? Zip. That's over $200,000 for every man, woman, and child in the United States. For decades, our leaders have warned of the dangers of our large and growing national debt.
Part of our trouble is that we have been self-indulgent, and now the bill has come due.
And yet today, the situation is more dire than ever.
Understand, if we don't take meaningful steps to rein in our debt, it could damage our markets, increase the cost of borrowing, and jeopardize our recovery. I refuse to pass this problem on to another generation of Americans.
We didn't create this problem.
We weren't the ones who spent the money.
We weren't the ones who left the bill for someone else.
We didn't ask for this problem, but we are the ones who will have to pay for it.
A great nation cannot stay great if it can't keep its economy strong. Let me talk to you about a way forward.
Doing nothing is not an option. It's not an option for our generation, and it's certainly not an option for future generations.
There are many possible solutions to our fiscal problems. We will discuss some examples to illustrate the kinds of changes that should be considered. Many combinations are possible, but what is critical is that we get started.
The failure to make the choice now of how to pay for the government we want is to dump the choice on our kids who will have no choice. So one of the calculations we need to make is that okay? Are we okay with that?
And this time, rather than talking about the problem, we're talking about solutions.
Chicago, Illinois. 150 members of the millennial generation are meeting to discuss the financial challenges they are facing. This meeting followed on the heels of 80 Million Strong, the inaugural gathering of millennials that focused on the economic condition of their generation.
I'm Maya Nista, and I'm the CEO of Mobilize.org. The millennial generation definitely shares a sense of urgent need to take action to improve the economic state of young America and put all Americans on a sustainable path.
It's very difficult for our generation because the debt situation, we're the one inheriting that, we're the one paying it off.
You know, I think the important thing about bringing all of these young people together with different ideas for solutions is that we learn from each other.
Hi everyone, my name is Ryan Sheneke and this is Brandon Atchinson, and we're presenting our project, WeCan'tPayThatTab.org.
The national debt represents the government's inability to live within its means.
So I don't think that it's a Republican or Democrat issue. It's really it's an issue for everyone.
I think the solution to it is going to be multifaceted. It's going to have to be fought on multiple fronts.
We can't afford for something else to happen.
I think the really scary part for us is it's kind of being handed to us on a plate and said, here you go, have fun with this. Congratulations, this is your problem. So there's this pressure to figure it out.
The national debt, or total federal debt, includes money that the government owes to programs like Social Security and Medicare, and debt it owes to the public. Because public debt has direct impact on the economy, it's the number we pay closest attention to. By the end of the year, the federal government will owe an estimated $9 trillion to the public. So just how much money is $9 trillion? With a number this large, it helps to compare it to the size of our overall economy, our gross domestic product. Our GDP is estimated to reach $14.6 trillion by the end of 2010. This ratio is known as our public debt to GDP and is the number most experts use when discussing our national debt because it is a way to determine how much we have borrowed relative to our national income. By the end of this year, our public debt to GDP will be approximately 62% and growing quickly. As with any loan, the more we borrow, the more we have to pay back with interest, and therefore cannot spend in other areas. Within 12 years, interest will be the largest item in the budget if we don't change course. Since 1789, the year our federal government was formed, we've had our ups and downs with the national debt. Wars and the Great Depression created high debt levels, but we'd always been able to bring debt back down to manageable levels, even after World War II, which is when our debt to GDP was at its highest point ever. Then, beginning in the 1980s, the national debt began growing quickly, despite the fact that our country experienced relative peace and prosperity throughout that time. Except for a period in the late 90s and early 2000s, when our government was running budget surpluses, our federal budget has consistently been in the red, and the national debt has been on an upward path as a result. At the rate we are going, we will pass the debt levels we saw at the end of World War II in just 10 years.
Well, the debt crisis we face is entirely of our own making. We have chosen to borrow so much money, and now we borrowed more and more from foreigners.
Last year, of the money that we borrowed, 68% of it came from foreign sources. Those foreign sources are warning us that they're increasingly impatient with our inability or unwillingness to tackle this debt explosion. If they would decide not to continue to loan us the money, we would then be in a very tough situation. We would either have to raise interest rates dramatically, or cut spending sharply, or raise taxes dramatically.
This is what debt does. It constrains you and puts you in a position where you're not going to be able to respond to crises that may confront future generations.
If we stay on our present course, in a little more than 20 years, estimated spending levels will be twice as large as projected revenues, and debt held by the public will exceed 200% of GDP. Life in America, especially for younger people who will be left to pay these debts, will be much different than it has been for their parents and grandparents.
And what are the most immediate action steps that our generation can take to improve this problem?
There are like specific root causes that lead us to this debt.
We've mentioned instant gratification a lot in this conversation and responsibility.
I came to this for personal reasons and some more idealistic reasons. My parents did everything by the book. They tried to be in a position where when they retired that they wouldn't be any type of a financial burden on their children.
Well, if you told me a year ago that 40% of our net worth, our retirement wouldn't be around, I wouldn't have believed that that was going to happen that fast, for sure. We thought that was locked and loaded.
In the past year, Drew's parents, Margaret and Stephen, downsized twice, from a large home in the suburbs to a large apartment, and then to a smaller apartment in the city.
Well, I'm glad I'm not a young parent right now.
So when I was a young parent, everything was up, all right? Your career, the possibility for making money, you know, 6-figure salaries were the minimum, you know? That's not the case today. They'll be lucky to make $80,000, and, you know, their whole lifestyle is going to be very different. It's the reality of life. My parents grew up with the Depression. They didn't expect anything, and they were always grateful for what they got. We were trained to expect. You know, we're the first generation where everybody went to college. We expected the world, and it turned out we got large chunks of it. But now I think it's probably receding back to a more realistic world, but they're going to have to deal with that, and I understand it, and I think they understand it too.
As the millennials face a much different world than their parents enjoyed, they're also confronted with the challenge of dealing with a government they can't afford. Let's look at the 2010 budget of the federal government to get a sense of where to begin tackling this problem. On the spending side, we have Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, Defense, all the other programs in the federal government, including law enforcement, education, agriculture, space and science, energy, and homeland security, to name just a few. And finally, interest on the national debt. That's everything. These programs, along with interest payments on the national debt, are known as mandatory spending. Mandatory spending is currently 62% of all federal spending and is the fastest growing part of the budget. These are all the other programs in the federal government and are called discretionary spending. They make up the remaining 38% of the federal budget. Okay, now, how do we pay for all this? Taxes. Let's look at our different revenue sources. Personal income taxes, payroll taxes, corporate income taxes, and other revenue. The rest? This is our budget deficit for the year. It's how much money America will need to borrow to pay for everything on the other side of this coin. When you're in a hole that you're trying to get out of, the first thing you need to do is stop digging. Serious budget reform is the first step in the right direction. The current budget process is not designed to address our overall fiscal challenge.
I think there's broad agreement that in a time of real deep recession that it's okay to run budget deficits, even big budget deficits. When the economy begins to recover, we really need to do something to make sure that we don't keep running even bigger budget deficits and adding to the debt.
The problem is really quite simple. Americans want lots of services from their government, and they have made promises in law that will mean higher federal spending in the future.
When we've had budget problems in the past, our leaders have done a better job of working together and enacting. During the 1990s, for example, tough budget controls, along with a growing economy, helped make fiscal responsibility a reality.
In a few moments, I will sign into law the first balanced budget in a generation.
Those budget controls helped take us from large and growing deficits to large and growing surpluses. But these controls expired in 2002, and the economy was recovering from a recession. The budget situation in Washington has been out of balance ever since.
There are two different kinds of categories of budget tools that can really help fix the situation. There's one category of tools that enforce budget deals.
For mandatory programs and taxes, there is pay-as-you-go, or pay-go. For discretionary programs, there are spending caps. Let's look at pay-go first.
I've long been an advocate for pay-go. If somebody is going to propose a tax cut, they have to pay for it. If somebody is going to propose an increase in mandatory spending, they have to find a way to pay for it.
Our fiscal challenge is too great to be solved with any one step alone, and we can't wait to act. And that's why last week I signed into law the pay-go bill. It says very simply that the United States of America should pay as we go and live within our means again, just like responsible families and businesses do.
Unfortunately, compared to the pay-go rules of the 90s, this is a weak version. A strong pay-go would not exempt so many tax cuts and spending increases and would apply to all mandatory programs. The other category of budget tools is discretionary spending caps, which would apply to 38% of the budget.
That limits how much the growth of discretionary spending can go forward each year. Those have been really effective in the past in limiting budget growth and keeping deficits from becoming a greater problem.
Pay-go and spending caps are positive measures, but they only help to keep the problem from getting worse. Many other steps will need to be taken.
Congresses by nature are good with the next election, but they're not good for the next generation. And as a result, Congress for a long time has been ignoring our long-term problems. And the long-term problem is that we're putting so much debt on the books that our kids cannot survive it. During the Bush years, there was not adequate fiscal discipline. For example, the Part D drug benefit, which was an $8 trillion unfunded mandate that shouldn't have gone on the books unless it had been paid for.
But more and more when Congress gets involved with the problem, it ends up making it worse.
The estimated cost of the Medicare D prescription drug bill was $395 billion over 10 years, which was the only cost that was debated and considered. The cost of the program exploded beyond 10 years, adding between 7 and 8 trillion in unfunded promises.
When we should have been digging our way out of the problem, we dug deeper.
If you don't have an attitude within the Congress that wants to limit spending, you're not going to limit spending. And basically, Congress wants to spend money because it's easier to get votes if you spend money than it is if you don't spend money.
One other solution to help our annual budget situation is to set a target for the nation's debt levels.
We should talk about something like stabilizing the debt at, say, 60% of GDP. That's a reasonable amount to shoot for. It's higher than we've historically been at, but it still would require an aggressive amount of debt reduction to get there. So it's both tough to do, but politically realistic. That's the kind of goal we need to think about.
The European Monetary Union sets a public debt to GDP target of no higher than 60% for countries using the euro. Countries who exceed the target must take action to reduce their debt or face sanctions. That level is intended to reassure creditors while still allowing room for new borrowing if needed to address emergencies or respond to other events like a recession.
If you wanted to get into the European Union, you couldn't have a public debt that exceeded 60% of your gross national product. Within 2 years, we will have a public debt that is around 70% of our gross national product. So we basically couldn't get in the European Union. Lithuania could get in, but we couldn't get in because we have such a problem with our deficits and our debt.
If we set this goal for ourselves, we'll have a realistic benchmark to shoot for when considering major reforms: defense and other spending, Social Security, healthcare, and taxes. To achieve our fiscal goals, we will have to look at each area of the budget and agree on changes. Next, we'll look at some illustrative approaches, but many other options and combinations of changes exist.
As a government, we haven't disciplined spending generally. We have allowed the government spending to basically exceed our ability to pay for it for year in and year out for a long time.
First, let's look at our defense and other spending. Outside of the 3 major entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, the federal government operates many other programs. Of these, national defense is the largest. This year, including spending for operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, defense represents more than 1/5 of non-interest spending.
I think we do have to look at military spending. That's been a very large cost and is projected to continue to be a very large cost for the country. And I think that has to come explicitly into the budget debate.
Since September 2001, lawmakers have provided $1.1 trillion for operations in Iraq and Afghanistan and for other war-related activities. That figure could rise if additional appropriations are required later this year to support the planned increase in troop deployments to Afghanistan. There is tremendous uncertainty regarding future military spending. At some point, efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan will phase down, and military spending will once again hit pre-war levels of funding, which will have a significant impact on our long-term financial goals. We should also engage in a range of defense planning, procurement, and other reforms. This includes reviewing weapon systems relative to anticipated current and future threats, making procurement and acquisition programs more effective and economical, and making sure military compensation and benefits programs are affordable and sustainable. As for the rest of the discretionary budget, which in recent years has been growing at approximately the same rate as the overall economy, diligent reviews of federal programs and elimination of those that are ineffective, outdated, or no longer meet current needs will help. That goes for smaller entitlement programs too. By re-examining defense and other spending and setting new priorities, we could lower the potential future debt levels. Now let's look at the largest and fastest growing part of the federal budget, our nation's mandatory spending policies. How fast are they growing?
By 2019, we'll be spending 92% of all the revenues we receive on entitlements and payment on the national debt, leaving just a little sliver left for all other expenditures of our government, including our national defense, education, public safety, and all those items that the American public know we need to have.
Either we will have to cut discretionary spending sharply, or we will continue to run large and growing budget deficits.
This is a growing problem over time. It wasn't created by the recession. It wasn't created by the financial crisis. It was created by decisions we made quite a long time ago when we created so-called entitlement programs, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security.
This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 30 million of our citizens against the loss of a job and against poverty-stricken old age.
When the program began in 1935, the normal retirement age was 65. Life expectancy was around 62. That normal retirement age stayed at 65 for decades, even as people were living longer and longer. Life expectancy today is 78. Over the coming years, the number of retired workers will increase dramatically, doubling between now and 2040. Not only will there be more retirees, but they will be living longer.
It just promises more than it can afford to pay for future generations. Now, I'm not talking about way off in the future. I'm talking about people who are in the workforce now.
There are a lot of real solutions out there. I think that the hopelessness comes from it seems so inevitable, it seems like there's real doom and gloom, like there's nothing we can ultimately do. But when people start participating in those solutions, they get an idea of what they are. Whether it's raising the retirement age, whether it's increasing payroll taxes, whether it's targeting benefits towards people that need them most.
Compared to healthcare reform and all these other huge problems that we face, Social Security is probably relatively easy. I say relatively.
One way to fix Social Security is to increase the retirement age over the next 10 to 15 years and index it for future improvements in life expectancy. If done gradually, those who are already retired or nearing retirement age will not be affected by the changes at all, and it will give younger Americans time to plan for the adjustments.
Slowly, over time, adjust the retirement age. After all, when Social Security was first initiated, people weren't living much past 65. Now we've got people living to 100.
Now that people keep their vitality past 65, I think it's important to have people working and contributing to the economy and saving well past 65.
Yet another option is to raise more revenue for Social Security.
We need to get more money into Social Security.
But Social Security is in financial difficulty.
Cash deficits for Social Security are expected to escalate in the future to reach an estimated $300 billion in 2025 and $1 trillion in 2048.
For the long term, we know there is an unfunded liability there that's going to have to be met. And so it's very much in our interest to reform Social Security so it's there for the future.
Today, Social Security payroll taxes are only collected on wages and salaries up to $106,800. People who make more don't pay any taxes on earnings above that ceiling.
We can raise the payroll tax a little bit, particularly raising the ceiling of the earnings to which it applies.
If, for example, this ceiling was raised from $106,800 to $181,500, a significant amount of revenue can be brought into Social Security, thereby decreasing future cash deficits. Smaller increases would also help, but not as much.
So we need to raise the threshold of salary level that people pay into Social Security.
We should review benefit costs. One area to consider is the automatic growth in benefits, which comes from two sources. First, at retirement, a worker's security benefits reflect lifetime earnings, which are automatically adjusted for inflation and for improvements in the standard of living. Second, after retirement, Social Security benefits are adjusted for changes in the cost of living, or COLA. Social Security reforms could be designed to preserve benefits for lower-income citizens who can't afford to save as much, while reducing benefits for the better off. For example, We could change the formula that sets the benefit levels so that the benefits of higher income workers would reflect inflation over their working years, but not the overall improvements in the standard of living. Those who earned higher incomes would still receive benefits, but they would receive less. The level of benefits for lower income retirees would continue to reflect both inflation and improvements in standard of living. We should continue to adjust retirees' benefits for changes in the cost of living, but the current COLA overstates the impact of inflation, and its accuracy could be improved. That would reduce costs while still allowing benefits to keep up with the cost of living.
Social Security has had an adjustment so that it keeps up with the cost of living. That is a tremendous additional draw on the fund, as is the huge increase in the number of people who are covered.
A modest reduction in the cost of living adjustment would contribute to the overall solution. A combination of these reforms, gradually introduced over time, would be relatively easy to implement and result in a Social Security system that is sustainable for generations to come.
I think Social Security reform is not only urgent, but it's not very difficult.
And by the time today's young people are eligible for Social Security, the program will be on a much sounder footing.
But what we need to do really is to tackle Social Security, and then we can go on to bigger and tougher things. The football analogy is, let's put some points on the board.
Put simply, our healthcare problem is our deficit problem. Nothing else even comes close.
With the adoption of healthcare reform legislation, it is more important than ever that we find ways to reform our healthcare system. Otherwise, costs of healthcare, including the cost of newly enacted benefits and subsidies, will continue to rise, putting our fiscal outlook at even greater risk.
If I were to worry about how we're going to have a sustainable financial future for the United States, healthcare would be at the top of the list of things I would worry about.
Well, I would say long-term, the story is overwhelmingly a story of healthcare. Our healthcare costs are way out of line with the rest of the world, and they're projected to get even more out of line in coming decades.
We have a Medicare cost crisis, but it's even more true that we have a national health cost crisis. We cannot solve the Medicare cost problem unless we solve the problem of cost for all of our nation's health care.
People want health care, and the average cost is rising very, very rapidly.
This country spends more per person on health care than any other country, and by no metrics are we getting the most for our money. So there's clearly a problem of what we're getting for all the money we're spending.
As educated as I feel like I am, I still feel disenfranchised from the conversation. I don't think I could even get involved with it.
The healthcare conversation, because you don't understand it.
Don't get it.
There's this feeling of all these benefits that we used to get are getting harder and harder and harder to come by because of the costs. And I don't know where the costs lie. Is it the fault of the insurance companies, or is it the fault of the medical providers because they're doing unnecessary things? It's kind of hard to sort it out.
We have a health system that, in terms of cost, is really out of control. And if you take this line and just project what has been happening into the future, we will get less and less competitive. So we need something else. That kind of a cost compared to the rest of the world is really, it's like a tapeworm eating, at our economic body.
Well, failure to reform our healthcare system leads to two problems. First, the quality of care will remain as remarkably uneven and inadequate as it is now. And secondly, healthcare for my children will become unaffordable. The opportunity to reform medical care for the entire population is tremendous. We can improve quality while slowing the growth in healthcare spending to something that's affordable.
Slowing the rate of growth of health spending by only 0.1% a year, and that alone would save $4 trillion over time. Surely to goodness we can shave off 0.1% of our growth rate.
But we ought to be trying now a number of strategies that will slow the growth of healthcare costs.
The passage of the healthcare bill is just the beginning. Now the real work begins. We must address the rapid growth in healthcare costs, which is absolutely essential to our economic and fiscal future. To do this, we will need to make a number of changes in the way healthcare is delivered, financed, and consumed.
We have to look at the way we pay our doctors and our hospitals.
The current way we pay for most healthcare in the United States is with an individual fee for a specific service, referred to as fee-for-service medicine. We pay hospitals that way, by and large, and we pay physicians that way. That rewards physicians for doing more services regardless of whether they're beneficial to the individual patient or not. It rewards hospitals for keeping their beds full, even if it's better for the patients not to be readmitted.
And one of the most important things for the public and for the profession to understand is that more is not necessarily better when it comes to health.
We basically have a delivery system which rewards quantity over quality and does not tie quality to value.
So we need to move away from fee-for-service payment. The second issue is that we have a fragmented delivery system where hospitals, physicians, nursing homes, each are working independently with no coordination among them. So the fragmentation in the U.S. healthcare delivery system is one of the problems we think is so important to address. Electronic medical records have tremendous potential to help with the problems faced by American healthcare. So by providing a common record that all of the physicians who are taking care of you can see could markedly improve coordination. If you have a chronic illness, you need your care taken care of over months and years, and we have no accountability anywhere in the system to improve your care as an individual. Putting those things together, better payment systems, better information systems, and ways of holding physicians accountable with hospitals, then we could really drive improvement in the healthcare system.
Some other ways include enacting malpractice reform, reducing administrative processes, reducing medical errors, and creating smarter healthcare consumers. In the current health insurance system, patients are often unaware of the true cost of medical tests and procedures. When you purchase something from a store, it comes along with a clear price tag. The same should be true of healthcare services.
With respect to healthcare, a large fraction of it is not paid out of pocket, but rather paid by insurance, so we are insensitive to prices.
One way to change this is to show the total cost of compensation, including the employer's share of the healthcare insurance, on pay stubs. This way, employees can see how much of their compensation is in healthcare, not just cash. Finally, we need better decisions about end-of-life care. About 30% of all Medicare payments are on behalf of people who will die within a year. We should encourage compassionate ways to handle difficult health decisions at the end of life that will lead to appropriate levels of care. These and other steps can help slow the rate of growth through our entire healthcare system, which is one of the biggest cost drivers in federal healthcare programs. Beyond slowing the rate of healthcare cost growth, there are other steps we can take to make our healthcare system sustainable. As a nation, we need to adopt healthier lifestyles.
It's important for us to recognize that how we live our lives has a huge impact on our future health.
The biggest thing to think about is how to get the public engaged in becoming a healthier nation so that people don't get sick in the first place. Well, people with multiple chronic diseases spend most of the Medicare money. So that's the target. That's where we need to focus.
The fact that we do not promote healthy lifestyles in the marketplace, we should give people incentives, cash incentives to pursue healthy lifestyles and prevention activity.
More physical exercise, healthier diets, less smoking.
All of these things contribute to a reduction in vulnerability to chronic disease and to disability and to illness and to hospitalization. So there is a cascade of benefits that have payoffs in health and payoffs in dollar savings.
That would reduce the costs of care, but most importantly, it would make us all feel better.
The new healthcare reform legislation assumes that Medicare providers will be paid less. Those savings may prove difficult to achieve. As a result, we will need to look at other ways to control the cost of federal health programs, especially the growth in Medicare.
The rising costs of federal health programs are the most important threat to the fiscal sustainability of the U.S. government. Medicare is the largest component of that threat. So reforming Medicare in a way that improves care while reducing costs is a critical challenge facing our country at this moment.
Right now, all the programs are an automatic pilot. There is no limit to how much the government will pay for your health care.
We might have to look at putting a cap on federal health care spending to see whether that will help make these hard choices, because right now we have an open-ended system, and so nobody has an incentive to control costs.
The Medicare problem, of course, is that the population eligible for Medicare, the elderly, is going to expand at a very rapid rate, and so the number of beneficiaries will increase, and with it, the costs of the program.
Another way to improve the financial strength of our Medicare program is to gradually raise the premiums for Medicare Part B, which includes outpatient care, doctor's services, physical or occupational therapy, and Part D, prescription drug benefits, both of which are voluntary programs, while providing financial assistance for those who need it. This would take a huge bite of our growing Medicare deficits and do so in a progressive manner, protecting those of lower means. And finally, if we gradually raise the eligibility age of Medicare, we will greatly enhance our nation's ability to offer effective healthcare programs to those who pay into it. This is not something that should be phased in quickly. It could be phased in over the next 10 to 20 years in an effort to give those who would be affected more time to plan for the changes.
Reforming Medicare is essentially the same as trying to reform our healthcare system. And to fix healthcare, we need not only Medicare, but all of the other payers to help physicians and hospitals come together to reform care and slow the growth of healthcare spending.
Unfunded Medicare costs will reach a staggering $38 trillion over the next 75 years. This is the greatest fiscal problem facing our nation.
Most Americans think we face an awful choice. We have to spend more and bankrupt ourselves or ration care. I think what the research shows quite clearly is that there is a third choice. We can redesign care so that healthcare is both affordable, covers everybody, and is better quality of care.
Finding ways to reduce overall healthcare spending and achieve savings in Medicare will be key to lowering future debt levels. When it comes to our exploding debt, nothing has a greater impact on it than our healthcare system. To the extent that we can fix our healthcare system and rein in cost, we will improve our financial situation. However, whatever we don't fix through healthcare, Social Security, and our defense and other spending policies, we will have to make up in the area of taxes.
Here's the situation we face. Over the long term, the real budget problem is that of growing government spending. Spending cuts are going to have to be part of the solution, and a big part, but there's no way we can close the budget gap that we face without also raising taxes.
The political system is clearly broken in fixing this problem, but our political system is really a reflection of our own personal preferences as a society. We believe that we are entitled to everlasting prosperity with increasingly large government benefits from the cradle to the grave, but we equally feel like we don't have a responsibility to pay for it. We're socialists when it comes to spending and libertarians when it comes to taxes.
We're going to have to decide which of the Bush tax cuts should be extended in whole or in part, and which ones should be allowed to expire or otherwise scale back.
If the 2001 and 2003 Bush tax cuts are extended, the revenues of the federal government would decrease significantly.
The cost of Bush tax cuts is about $2 trillion over 10 years. And to put that in perspective, that's double the cost of expanded health care coverage that everyone's complaining that we can't afford.
Matter of fact, not only do I think we ought not to raise them, I think we ought to make every tax cut we pass permanent.
One of the things that I've noticed in the past several years is that you can't even discuss revenue increases or tax increases. Taxes can only go one way, they can go down.
Recent estimates by the Congressional Budget Office conclude that by letting the Bush tax cuts expire, federal tax revenues would go up by an average of 1% of GDP per year, or about $2.6 trillion over the next 10 years. But that's not enough to solve our problem. Finding other revenue sources may be unavoidable.
We're going to have to look at consumption taxes like a value-added tax or some form of national sales tax as a mechanism for maintaining some of the benefits that we have promised through our entitlement programs.
All the industrial countries have a national sales tax of some sort.
Consumption taxes would do more than just raise revenues. They would make consumer spending more expensive and could help encourage people to save more of their incomes. That, in turn, would increase domestic savings and reduce our reliance on foreign lenders. Another way to close our long-term gap is to modernize the tax system.
I think the current tax system is just deeply flawed. It's been amended repeatedly over many years, and it's really become a monstrosity.
The United States tax code is made up of almost 10,000 different sections. Much of the system is confusing, outdated, and filled with loopholes. There are many tax preferences that result in almost $1 trillion in lost revenue every year. The special tax treatment of employer-paid health care and home mortgage interest payments are the two largest examples. Furthermore, our complex and burdensome corporate tax system puts American companies at a competitive disadvantage internationally.
I think our tax system has gone very much awry in the last 10 years.
Streamlining and eliminating many of those tax loopholes could bring in a lot more revenue for the government.
I think it's going to require us to write a new tax system, one that's more fair.
The world has changed many times on taxes over the years. If you read the history of the tax code, there have been a lot of swings in both public opinion and activities in Congress. The one thing I can promise you is it'll be different 20 years from now.
There's a lot of ideas. We could spend the next 6 hours debating taxes. The last topic, taxes, once everybody got involved in the voting, they realized that it's a really big issue and they wanted to be part of it.
Some combination of revenue changes will be required to help lower the potential future debt levels. If we wait until 2030 to balance the budget, we will have to cut spending by 48% or raise taxes by 64%, which is equivalent to more than doubling individual income taxes. These percentages rise with the passage of time. Therefore, we need to start now to determine how to put our nation's finances in order.
The problems that we're facing are not going to be solved without making some very fundamental choices, and you can't take things off the table. Bottom line is, whatever government chooses to spend, eventually it's going to have to tax to pay for. I mean, that's the way government pays for things. There's no magic.
Our four main areas, defense and other spending, Social Security, healthcare, and taxes, are the cornerstones for our major financial reform in America. The sum total of all these illustrative reforms are but one way to get us to the 60% of GDP target. Many other combinations of solutions are possible, but what is critical is that we get started.
You have to make tough choices on spending constraints, on social insurance reforms, on health care costs, on tax reforms. Tough choices are inevitable.
You see any of those choices made while you were here?
No, that's why we need a special process. They won't be made, in my opinion, Senator. They won't be made in the regular order because the regular order is dysfunctional.
There is no serious person that has looked at our projected growth in debt and not concluded we're on an unsustainable course.
There's some very tough decisions that have to be made, but in some respects, they are tough politically, not necessarily economically.
Sadly, perhaps tragically, the long term is now right next door. It's right around the corner.
Right now, there is a strong sense by a large number that fiscal constraint is essential to be applied now. The longer we wait, the more difficult it will be.
You know, the American people have shown if they're told the truth about a problem, they'll face up to it and they'll support action. And that's really what's required now.
Our challenge is to act sooner rather than later.
Determining which areas will experience the greatest level of reform is what we as a nation need to decide.
Seeing where our generation stands on these issues, we have people from all over the spectrum. There's a lot of agreement going on here. All of us seeing that we do agree on these things is encouraging.
Because as long as this stuff still happens, you can cut this apartment in half, and we'd still want to have dinner together. We'll figure it out.
I would definitely say that this is a group of fighters. Even though a lot of us may feel overwhelmed by it, I don't think we're going to be conquered by it. I think we are the generation that feels that we can do this.
Appears you share my enthusiasm for the information in this video, this documentary. And as I said in the beginning, Dr. Gordon now will update from the
2010 until present day, up to probably right today, because he's been in Washington. And after that, we'll go to some questions. And now, if you would like to write a question out, just raise your hand, and our staff will distribute some cards through the aisles. Dr. Gordon?
Okay. I'll take you through a couple of quick slides to update you. Let me also say a little bit about my organization, just so you know. The Concord Coalition was started in the early 90s to be a grassroots force for educating the public about these issues. Our founders, who were former Senator Paul Tsongas from Massachusetts, former Senator Warren Rudman from New Hampshire, got together after the 92 election when, if you remember, Paul Tsongas lost to Bill Clinton in the primary, but Ross Perot was also in that election. And there was a lot of focus on fiscal policy then. They thought that ultimately politicians in Washington were only going to make these tough choices on the long term if their constituents were informed and they felt like they could talk openly and honestly with their constituents about the need for hard choices, and also for constituents to press their members of Congress to think about the long term and future generations. So that's why our organization goes around the country trying to educate the public about this. That's how the Fiscal Wake Up Tour began, and that led to the two documentaries. The first I.O.U.S.A, I should mention, is still available on Netflix or Amazon if you want to check that out. And also, let me just say, just so there's no anger when we get to questions, all of those solutions in that movie are not the Concord Coalition or mine or anyone's comprehensive plan for how to fix the problem. Ultimately, constituents, along with their elected representatives, will decide on the best solutions. That movie just gives a pretty decent rundown of some of the major choices being discussed. And I can talk a little bit about what was just discussed during the super committee process. But let me update you real quick on the numbers. You saw that the 2009 deficit was $1.4 trillion in the movie. The 2010 deficit wound up being $1.4 trillion, and 2011 wound up being $1.3 trillion. The projection for 2012 is about $1.1 trillion. So the last 4 years, or the 4 years that we're talking about, are all going to have pretty similar deficits. But it's important to point out that the blame cannot be only placed on irresponsible fiscal decisions, at least for the last 4 years, because the recession really takes a dramatic toll on government revenues because less people are working and paying taxes. People who are working are getting paid less, so they're paying less taxes. We have spending programs that increase in spending whenever there's a recession for like food stamps, unemployment insurance. So automatically in a recession, you lose revenues and you increase spending. And then on top of that, Congress and the President have passed a number of tax cuts and spending increases designed to stimulate the economy. So that leads to this $1.3, $1.4 trillion deficits that we've faced. Also, I should point out that one thing the United States is lucky about is that our interest costs have not changed very much on an annual basis over the last 4 years, because right now we're allowed to borrow at very low levels of interest rates, mainly because everyone else in the world is doing so much worse than we are that people still want to put their money here because they think it's the safest place to place their money. And so that allows us to borrow cheaply, and it also will probably be the case for at least 5 to 10 years in the worst case scenario if you look around the globe. So we do have the advantage of having some time to work these things out as a country before our global creditors are going to start wanting to take all their money. So this is really the key time to get started to make some of these reforms. If we look forward for the next 10 years, this deficit picture has actually improved a bit from the movie, primarily because of the legislation that was passed in August, which pretty much entirely cut spending from that discretionary side of the budget, that part of the budget that's ever shrinking. The legislation passed cut spending on paper, at least, by about $2.2 trillion over 10 years. So that leads us with, according to the Congressional Budget Office, that top blue line, a $3.5 trillion cumulative deficit over the next 10 years. That red line, which I'll explain in a minute, is a more plausible scenario if you take some of the current policy choices members of Congress tend to make on an annual basis. Things look considerably worse than what's written into current law. But it is important to point out that if Congress and the president left Washington for the next 10 years, didn't touch any pieces of the legislation, the budget deficit situation over 10 years would actually improve pretty dramatically. And so, I mean, that's something to keep in mind. Whenever you hear Congress arguing about this policy or that policy, keep in mind that they're only going to make things worse, at least for a little while. Over the long term, we're headed towards increased debt regardless of what Congress and the president do over the next 10 years, and that's because of those mandatory spending program increases. Just to give you a perspective on some of those choices that Congress makes pretty regularly that will increase the deficit. Batteries fell out. So let me talk you through them while we put the batteries back in. To get from that $3.5 trillion current law deficit to the projections that are more plausible, if you look at extending the tax cuts, that's about $3 trillion. If you fix the alternative minimum tax, which normally goes along with extension of the tax cuts, that adds another $1.7 trillion. If you extend a bunch of little loopholes, deductions, and small tax provisions, that adds another $900 billion. And then if you extend the payroll tax cut for another year, that's about $160 billion. So the revenue changes that almost all members of Congress are on record as supporting adds another $5.7 trillion over the next 10 years. Now, it is true that the president and some Democrats want to allow the upper income tax cuts to expire, but that would only change this by about $800 billion. So that's really not a huge amount of revenue difference. And then on the spending side, that line should actually say if we allow spending to grow at the rate of inflation instead of following these automatic triggered cuts that you might have heard about that are scheduled to happen, about $1.2 trillion of additional cuts in discretionary spending are scheduled to happen over the next 10 years because of that August debt deal. And if we assume that those don't happen, and members of Congress are already talking about changing that, you're looking at another $2 trillion. And then if we assume the war costs change, that actually helps the deficit, because right now those projections are for the current rate of spending to continue. And then there's a doctor payment fix that's done annually in Medicare that'll add about $430 billion. So that gets you from the current law, $3.5 trillion, to what we call current policy. So that's what happens if Congress and the president stay in office and don't enact any new policies. This is really just to continue current policies over the next 10 years. So if we look at spending and revenues as a percent of GDP, as the movie makes clear, is a really good way to look at things. We've averaged about 21% spending. We take in about 18%. That little blip where those lines switched was the late 1990s when we had a few years of budget surpluses. Quickly went back to normal, and then you can see with the recession how dramatically those lines have diverged. So if we continue on current policy path, what happens to our debt held by the public? The movie ended in about 2010 with debt held by the public of 61% of GDP. At the end of 2011, it was almost 70% of GDP, and it's projected to really climb dramatically over the next 30 years. And this is really the key chart that I'll show you and really the foundation for what we do. If you go out, there's no axis here showing the years, but that last year is 2040, and the top line is about 300% of GDP. So the largest debt we've ever had is 109% of GDP right after World War II. Now we're at about 70, and over the next 30 years, we're projected to go up to 300% of GDP. Well, I have some good news for you. We are not going to make it to 300% of GDP debt. The bad news is that because somewhere along that curve, the economy will crumble, and we won't be allowed to borrow any more money, and we would look a lot like Greece looks today, with riots in the streets and inability to borrow, and almost no amount of cutting or tax raising we could do that would allow us to stay in business. So the key is somewhere along that red slope, we're going to have to make a decision to change that trajectory. The question is, when are we going to do it? The longer we wait, the more dramatic the decisions we have to make will be. We covered this. Let me just give you this graph real quick. There was a lot of talk about healthcare costs and the aging of the population being the primary drivers of the explosion of debt. And this gives you an idea that actually over the short term, the aging of the population is a more dramatic, more influential driver than healthcare costs. But over time, healthcare costs really begin to take over and drive almost everything that happens in the federal budget. The healthcare law that was passed on paper actually made a pretty dramatic difference in Medicare, because there were a fair amount of Medicare cuts on paper that occurred in the health care bill. The blue line is what would happen if we don't do any of those cuts. The red line is what happens if we somehow manage to do them all, which over the long term is pretty unrealistic based on just how we have our current health system structured. But on paper, that actually was a significant improvement. The problem is that also, if you look at the paper, total federal healthcare spending under that new law is almost unchanged from what it was before, because all of those Medicare savings were put into another health insurance subsidy, this one for the uninsured, on the health exchanges. So really, the law did nothing horribly bad, but also on paper, nothing horribly good either, or remarkably good. The real key is whether we build on that law and continue to work on bringing healthcare costs down, and that's something we can talk about during question and answers. In less than 15 years, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest on the debt will consume all federal revenues, meaning there will be nothing left over for any of our other spending programs unless we continue to borrow to support them. I talked a little bit about that August act that cut a fair amount of discretionary spending, but really left the rest of the budget untouched. The super committee was supposed to have tried to get another $1.2 trillion worth of cuts, but they were unable to agree. All they needed was a simple bipartisan majority to do something. The hope was they would take their special place, as David Walker said in that video, we need a special process outside of the regular order. Well, Congress had that, and they were unable to agree on anything. But the hope was that they would be able to not just cut discretionary spending, but really start to work on reforming the tax code and those other programs, and that still remains undone. If those triggers go into effect, again, most of them comes from discretionary spending, and about half of all the cuts are going to be from the defense budget, and the other half from other discretionary programs and mandatory spending. In about a year ago, there was a remarkable group of bipartisan legislators that met to hash out a proposal for what could we do to change that trajectory. That green slope is the same slope as that red slope I warned you about in that graph before. And what these Republicans and Democrats got together and got a majority to agree on was a series of reforms to all aspects of the federal budget that would actually bring that line down to a sustainable rate. So if you think there's no one in Washington who is thinking about making some of these changes, that's not true. They had a remarkable majority, and about 45 members of the Senate and 100 members of the House during the latest supercommittee deliberations pledged their support for anything the supercommittee could do that would get close to that commission proposal called the Bowles-Simpson. Unfortunately, the supercommittee just couldn't pull the trigger on anything like that. So again, that remains out there as a good idea for us to consider in the future. And I'll leave it there, and we can talk more with your questions.
All right, thank you, Dr. Gordon. And now we will start with the questions while my associate Janet Long has been looking at them to collect the duplication and so forth. I want to just get it started by asking you, Dr. Gordon, to address the students in this audience. There are a number of them. I was impressed with the statement near the end by the young lady who said, "We are the generation that can do this." What should the students and the thousands that others here at this at our campuses do to stop this craziness?
Well, I mean, you always have to say vote, because that's the key to all of this. And the more young people vote, obviously, the more their voices will be listened to. But realistically, they'll never be able to vote at the same rate that the older generations are able to. So the other thing is that all generations play a part in these solutions. And one of the things that we find the most when we go around the country is we have this exercise called Principles and Priorities, where you can kind of make these choices over 10 years to reform programs and see how much savings you can get. And a lot of the times we do them with members of Congress in town hall meetings that have a really good mix of senior citizens, working age population, and young people. And when you see these intergenerational groups get together and work, you'd think, oh my gosh, there's going to be a huge conflict. They're never going to be able to agree. They have different values. They care about different programs. And that almost is never the case. And especially you grandparents in the audience, one of the things we find is that while parents care about their kids somewhat, they really care about their grandchildren. And so I know that from my parents. When they come and visit, it's always the grandkids that get the first hugs and kisses. And this is really the case universally. And so these issues are really going to affect our grandchildren and the children of our grandchildren. And so I think everyone has that kind of respect for the generational process and the social compact. And the key is to get politicians to feel that as well and not feel that they have to be afraid of one generation voting them out of office because of policies that favor another generation.
Do you agree with the statement that was made by some of the foundation people that the American people would go along with these, that we would be willing to do these if our leaders led us, and or are we too used to the free lunch where we want these benefits but don't like to pay for them?
I don't think that's the case. I think the media tends to overdo this free lunch mentality. If you look at every other generation, this is the 70th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. That generation rose up to the challenge. The last generation, while certainly not in the same vein, we've been through a numerous different budget crises, economic crises, and the country has always pulled out of them. There was a bipartisan budget deal in 1990. There was a bipartisan budget deal in 1997. No matter what you say about that debt ceiling deal, it was actually bipartisan as well. So it's not like this can't happen. It's just a matter of getting the political process to get used to accepting this kind of shared sacrifice. It's something that's happened in the past and clearly is something that can happen in the future, and really something that has to happen because no one wants to see us turn into Greece. So one of the things my boss likes to say is that people thought in the beginning that the Wake Up Tour was a doom and gloom tour. But really the point is that if it was all doom and gloom, we wouldn't be going on a tour. We'd be sitting in a bunker in our house drinking scotch, right? It's that we're optimistic that these changes will happen. And so it's just a question of having the politics coincide for both parties to get them forward.
Good, okay. I'm going to go to one of the questions from the audience. What if estate taxes were to rise to pre-George W. Bush days? What impact would that have on the deficit?
Oh man, specific budget numbers. I'm not going to be able to do these off the top of my head, but I believe just the estate tax portion of the extension of those tax cuts costs about $90 billion over 10 years. So that is a lot of money. It certainly is not the only answer when you're looking at an additional $10 trillion worth of deficits over 10 years. So that's about where we are.
Okay. Here's one that relates to the global situation. What is the long-term impact of the situation of the world economy, especially China and Europe? Europe's sort of teetering. Some people, Time magazine had a cover story a month ago, late October, that said the China bubble may burst soon, and that will bring all of us down too. What's your outlook on that?
Wow, that's a tough question. So I'll take it in the two parts. The European issue is really a very current problem, almost entirely related to the credit bubble and the recession. So I think having the European countries agree to make enough changes so that the euro doesn't break apart is probably the single most important thing for our economy right now. If the euro breaks apart and the European Union breaks apart to some degree, I think the Federal Reserve says there's like a 3 in 5 chance of a recession or something like that happening again in this country. So that's incredibly important over the short term. Over the long term, a stable euro, which I will just go ahead and assume will happen, that they'll also make the necessary changes, and a China that becomes, in a way, more modern in its economy, I think are really important. While ultimately the United States will not have the single superpower stance that we have now, where our dollar is the international currency, and so we're able to borrow at cheap rates at times like today. Ultimately, it will be better for us if the Chinese people stop saving as much and start becoming consumers, because that opens up a market for us. That's one of the reasons why they have this bubble, that they have so much savings and not enough middle-class consumers, and so they're almost completely dependent on exports. And when the rest of the world has trouble buying exports because of recession, the Chinese have a big problem. So a really slow modernization of China, a return to a stable Europe, can only be good for us. The world economy is not a zero-sum game where as China rises, we fall. We all get better as every country has a growing economy. So over the long term, I mean, I sound like a crazy optimist right now when I talk about the long term, but it just makes sense that that'll happen, and we'll be fine when that happens.
We can all use some optimism right now, I think, so thank you for that. Here's a good question. This is a really good one. We know the problem and possible solutions. How do you break up the partisanship in Washington?
Over the short term on this, I'm not so optimistic, I guess I would say. You have a presidential election in 2012. And I think after every presidential election, you tend to have a period where it's possible to have bipartisan cooperation. So I think 2013 will be a really crucial year. There are a lot of things that are going to happen at the end of 2012 and the beginning of 2013 that make a budget agreement pretty likely. You have the expiration of the 2001-2003 tax cuts, and that'll be the end of 2012 after the election. And then in 2013, you'll have the first sequesters for this trigger where you're going to have pretty dramatic cuts to the defense budget and to other parts of the federal budget. So I think that gives us a really good opportunity to kind of reset, see what happens with the presidential election, and hope that the leaders will then get together, whoever winds up in power at that point, take a look at those really big fiscal issues that are on the table and the ones down in the future, and to start working on taking slices out of that long-term fiscal challenge. But, I mean, we are a partisan government. We have a partisan government. We probably will always have one, at least for any time that we can see, because of the way our political institutions are structured. And so it's just a matter of getting the parties to see that sometimes cooperating is a benefit to both of them.
Thank you. Good answer. Here's another good question that I would have wanted to ask a gentleman. Mr. Kelly asked it. A corporation like GE does not pay any taxes. I don't know if that's true, but he thinks that's true. I hope it is. Yet nets billions every quarter. Why does the government continue to let this happen? Government should tax extra for anyone or corporation who banks offshore. U.S. banks have so much cash on hand, they're refusing large sums of money to put into savings account, yet take away a person's home, repossession, and third world countries do not do this. It's sort of not a question, but invites your comment.
Well, let me take the tax part first, because the one slide I actually didn't show you Oh, maybe I didn't even have it in the slide chart. One of the real, I think, revelations over the last year and a half in Washington is that on the surface, the decision on whether to raise taxes is really the cause of the stalemates that we've seen in Washington. I think over the short term, getting revenue increases is a major roadblock to how the super committee proceeded and how the debt ceiling deal went down to only cut discretionary spending and nothing else. But over the long term, there actually is a consensus brewing underneath all of that top-line partisanship that our tax code is a disaster and riddled with things we call tax expenditures, which are the deductions and credits built into the tax code. To the point now where if you add up all of the tax expenditures in a year, they actually cost about $1 trillion, which is more than we spend on non-defense discretionary spending. So we have this non-defense discretionary budget. It goes through the appropriations process. Congressman Young is on the appropriations committee and deals with this every year. But then we have this whole nother $1 trillion that the government basically sends out that does not get the same scrutiny as those spending programs because it's done through the tax code, administered by the IRS. No one knows why some of these deductions are there. A lot of them are actually very perverse in what they do to the economy, especially the home mortgage interest deduction and the unlimited deduction for healthcare insurance. We saw what happened when housing became this bubble, and one of the reasons is that our tax code encourages the purchase of bigger and more expensive houses because the more money you spend on a house, the larger tax deduction you get. And the richer you are, the larger tax deduction you get for your house. So these tax expenditures are really a disaster, and the Republican Party and the Democratic Party are beginning to see that. And so while we might always have a debate in Washington over what the top rate should be for the wealthiest, how many income tax brackets there will be and what those rates should be, underneath that all is this pretty universal agreement these days that we need to broaden the base, cut out all those deductions and loopholes, and then we can actually keep the rates we have or even lower them and still bring in more money. So the corporate tax code is very similar to the individual income tax in that way with these deductions and loopholes. And so there really is a brewing consensus that for both the corporate tax and the individual income tax, we need to eliminate a lot of those inefficient deductions and tax expenditures, and that allows us to bring in a ton of revenue and perhaps even lower rates, if not at least keep the rates in place that we have today and not have to raise them to bring more revenue to help the fiscal challenge.
Good, thank you. Here's one that the documentary alluded to in reducing or controlling healthcare costs. Since most of Medicare's costs are incurred in the patient's last year of life, doesn't it make sense to cap Medicare coverage after a certain age, say 80, and admit to ourselves that we are mortal instead of forcing the U.S. taxpayers to keep us alive beyond our useful and enjoyable years? Good question there, sir.
Well, the short answer is no. It does not make sense to cap Medicare at age 80. But, I mean, there are a number of, well, first of all, let me just say that this is going to be hard to hear, and I hesitate to do it when there's not a real give and take when I have to answer yellow cards. But I just looked at a couple of studies that actually show this whole end-of-life care issue is actually not the cost driver that we think it is. That if we had a more sensible policy for end-of-life care, it would not dramatically decrease Medicare spending. There are a lot of reasons why that is, and I think if you actually read the studies, you could be convinced also. The short answer there is that the older you get, actually, the less you cost a year per capita. Because if you're living longer, it means you probably did not have those chronic diseases. And so just doing something on end-of-life care is not going to save a ton of money. But that being said, there is a huge amount of inefficiency and waste in what we spend on medical care, especially for those who are over the age of 65 and do have chronic diseases. And there are a million ways we can improve the Medicare program to handle those cases better that would lead to dramatic decreases in costs. And I think one of the promising things about the healthcare law that was passed is that there are a ton of pilot projects and experiments on how to change the coordination of care to help and become more efficient for those with chronic diseases. So that is one of those areas where Elliot Fisher in the documentary talked about how we can actually have better healthcare and lower costs at the same time. So again, that's one of those areas where we can feel a little sense of optimism. If the political system can put the right solutions into place, we can actually claim some money back there. And then there are other things you can do with Medicare to, one of the things that was brought up is you can increase the retirement age or index it to life expectancy. I actually personally am much more wishy-washy on that solution than perhaps the documentary is. But I mean, there are other ways that we can deal with those problems.
Well, I think that the point made in this question about our mortality needs to be addressed. I have doctor friends from a previous research project who contend that America is not willing to deal with the reality of death. We push it in the background. We don't deal with it. And if we did, we would probably spend our healthcare dollars more wisely.
I think that's true. I can say that that's true, although we say that with the hindsight of looking at how other countries control their healthcare costs and assume it's because in some way they feel differently about death. And if you look at how the costs of new medical technologies increase healthcare spending throughout the world, I'm not so sure. I think everyone's pretty afraid of death and wants their doctors to do everything they can when it comes to facing mortality. But we experienced a pretty perverse episode during the healthcare debate where a simple provision that was bipartisan to give doctors the ability to counsel their patients in Medicare on living wills and some end-of-life issues, and that had pretty much universal support before August of 2009, I guess it was. And then things, went a little bit haywire, and that provision was stripped. I think there is an acknowledgement on the part of people in government and pretty much across the country that we do need to be a little bit more sensible and less sensitive about such taboo subjects as living wills, which almost everyone has to sign when they go to a hospital anyway. So I think that's one of those things that will be revisited in a quiet time when maybe people aren't paying as much attention, and that'll start bringing some sensible policy.
And hopefully without depicting it as pulling the plug on Granny.
Yes.
Here's a really good question. There are a lot of them. There are so many here, but it kind of is in that line. Well, no, it's in a different tack. Your opinion as to why, A, there are only 200 to 300 people in the room tonight, and B, the average age of them must be 60 plus. How do we solve a crisis if people are apathetic and remain uninvolved? What a great question.
Well, I don't know. Some of you see 200 people and think it's a disaster. I see 200 people and I'm pretty happy that that many people turned out on a weeknight at 6 o'clock to watch a movie and then hear a speaker for 2 hours.
Me too.
And listen, it's freezing out there, right? So I think it's pretty impressive. And the age of the people who show up, I'm going to be speaking to a class tomorrow morning on campus, and so I'll hit the same number of senior citizens and college-age students. So I'm not too worried about that.
Okay. Here's a question. Will a flat tax, parenthesis 12%, or a consumption tax effectively raise more revenue than the current tax system, or is spending still too much regardless?
Again, I think a simple answer would be yes. Spending will be too much for any system of taxation that brings in the same amount of revenue we brought in for the last 40 years. So you will need to raise more taxes and cut a pretty substantial amount of spending. A specific number to put on the flat tax is something that gets debated a lot. I think the Congressional Budget Office, when they last looked at it, thought a flat tax would have to be about 30% in order to replace all of the other taxes in the system, payroll taxes, income taxes. So that's substantially higher than 12%. And also, it depends how we do a flat tax. You can do a flat tax that has as many loopholes and deductions as our current income tax. And then that could push the rate to 50 cents, which would make us even more inclined to have loopholes and deductions.
What about, do you have an opinion on 999?
Well, 999 was a 27% flat tax, basically, a consumption tax. So I think, I think it's a pretty dramatic change for this country to completely scrap all forms of taxation and replace it with a different form of taxation. I think realistically, especially because we only have about 30 years to deal with this problem before, well, not even 30 years. We're guaranteed within 30 years, if we haven't dealt with it, to have some sort of collapse. So over the short term, these dramatic tax system changes, I'm not sure are the way to go, just because it would take too long and be hard to do. That said, my boss was on a bipartisan commission that was a non-governmental shadow commission to the president's debt commission that I talked about a little bit. And they simplified the income tax and then added on a, I think, 6% consumption tax or sales tax or VAT, whatever you want to call it, that they thought that was better for economic efficiency than raising income tax rates enough to get the needed revenue, because we tend to spend more than we save in this country, and having a tax system that puts a brake a little bit on consumption and encourages saving helps overall economic growth. That's why most of the European countries have some form of value-added tax. They also have income taxes, but they have these combo tax systems, and I think a lot of economists think some sort of combined tax system with a consumption tax combined with an income tax is probably optimal in terms of bringing in enough revenue, but not harming economic growth so much. So.
Okay. Do you think if more people bought made in American products that, and brought manufacturing back to the U.S., that would increase revenue and taxes, and would that help?
I think bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. is probably a necessary solution to all this that doesn't fit neatly into a package of, budgetary agreements. But it's a very long-term problem. But the idea that we'll be able to go on for 30 or 40 years without any way to make our own products, just depending on the rest of the world and having large trade deficits, is probably unrealistic. So we do need to do something to rebuild our manufacturing base, but that's easier said than done.
Well,
and probably out of the purview of my expertise, I should add, to get more into detail about it. Okay, go ahead.
Whispers, or not whispers, but hints here and there of some manufacturing coming back because, one, the wage levels of China, so countries like China, are rising to the point that we now almost, our wage levels are almost competitive, plus the advantage of not having to ship it back from there and quality control. Wouldn't all of those help?
Yeah, and it will require some innovative federal government policy that sparks major changes in private company behavior. The federal government can't do this with a flick of the pen. It's really going to require some sort of major coordinating effort.
Does that have to do with the tax credit or tax advantages that corporations get when they offshore jobs?
I think that's certainly part of the factor that large multinational corporations consider when they decide where to locate manufacturing. But I mean, the quality of our education system, our federal budget situation, levels of taxes and benefits, all of those things combine to disadvantage us over the short term. But if we fix them, advantage us over the long term.
Is it true that there isn't tax advantage to offshoring?
Yes, it is true.
So it sounds
with
like
an asterisk, depending on the industry you're in and whether you get the right kind of deductions and credits and stuff like
that. Well, it sounds like a no-brainer to do something about that to bring jobs back here. Well, maybe that's it.
That probably requires a political answer.
A partisan direction, and we don't want to do that. Here's one about China. The documentary showed a tremendous monetary amount borrowed from China. Why, then, and how did China become such a large part of our imports with so many American companies establishing plants overseas? So it's related to that, too. For example, most items are tagged made in China, and I also saw an American flag at a hardware store that was made in China.
I think the big effect over at least the last 10 or 15 years where China has become a much larger owner of our debt is because China buys our debt to make their goods cheaper here through the currency levels. If they buy more of our U.S. debt, their currency goes down relative to ours, making their goods cheaper here, making us go to Walmart and buy made in China instead of made in America because we're price sensitive and we want to save money when we go to those stores. So I think over the last 10 or 15 years, China has, I don't want to say manipulate because we're not allowed to say that as a country at least, but they have, by buying our debt, caused their exports to be cheaper here. And over the long term, as I said, if they modernize their economy, become less export dependent, that will really lead them to buying less of our debt, allowing their currency to appreciate the way it should against ours, and also equalizing the terms of trade at least a little bit.
And isn't part of the problem the fact that we all are consumers who want the lowest price?
I wouldn't consider that a problem. I consider that the point. So the key is how to rebuild our manufacturing to where we're buying made in American products. We don't want to buy made in American products if they're more expensive just because we're patriotic, because that's not how businesses should work. I think an interesting case is what's happening with solar panels right now, that the United States was really a leader in solar panel technology. China came in and really subsidized very heavily their solar panel industry, causing a lot of the solar panel countries, I'm sure, companies in the country, I'm sure you've heard of one of them, to lose their businesses and go bankrupt because they just couldn't keep up with the levels of prices that were happening for solar panels for China. Yet, the whole story is not that cheap Chinese goods are bad. Because if you want solar panels, because we want to be energy efficient, we want that to be as cheap as possible so more people use solar panels and become energy efficient. The answer is to find a way to compete better. If the government needs to subsidize for a short time to help that industry mature, then that's fine. But over the long term, we want our industries to be able to compete on price, and that is how they will ultimately be successful for the long term, and quality, of course.
Here's a question I wanted to be sure to get in. I didn't see it readily in the question from the audience. What do you think of the Occupy Wall Street movement, and now it's Occupy the Capitol movement? Does it have legs, or is it just a passing fad? Does it have the potential to really change anything?
Again, this is probably out of my purview of expertise. I would just say that in general, active citizens protesting the government is never bad.
Peacefully.
Peacefully, yes. So, I mean, certainly part of the Concord Coalition with our small 16-person staff is pretty envious of the media attention and the amount of people that show up to these Occupy Wall Street protests. But I think really citizen involvement is crucial to political change, and I think we probably all agree we need political change. So as long as it's peaceful, I don't see anything. Whether it has legs, that's not in my expertise to guess. I wouldn't even be able to do it.
Thank you. Thank you. This has to do with zero-based budgeting, I think. Why is there no discussion on changing the policy that allows government expenditures and budgets to go up automatically without zero-based budgets? This would make them justify the need to exist.
It's funny, I just got that question somewhere else, so there must be some media source that's really talking a lot about zero-based budgeting. I think again, there's a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is with a budget the size of ours and a country the size of ours, and the way the government's structured, it would be almost impossible to do a true annual zero-based budgeting. That being said, I think there needs to be some effort in Congress, and I don't know really what the structure of this is to be, but ultimately all of these things we're talking about is figuring out what kind of social insurance system we need, what kind of industrial policy we need, and really thinking about the long term and how to structure the government's decisions with an eye towards the long term. And so Congress has to find a way to break out of the annual appropriations, the annual authorization debates, the annual budget debate, and assign the task to some group, some subgroup, to start looking long term and come up with some set of principles that we can use to really guide our budgetary decisions going forward. I think that would be very fruitful. It doesn't have to be zero-based budgeting, although certainly every line item in the budget should be scrutinized. But I think we actually probably underappreciate the degree to which that already happens. When you impose the type of spending discipline that Congress is going to have if they don't eliminate the trigger, certainly the non-discretionary spending part of the budget is pretty well scrutinized. The defense budget, if they try and cut another $450 billion over the next 10 years, will also have to be heavily scrutinized. And but most of our government is an insurance company for Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on the debt. And so those are large programs that you couldn't really zero-base because you know how many people are eligible for benefits. You know the basic structure of those benefits. And so we just have to do something to think about the long term of how we want those programs structured to figure out a way forward.
Okay. This is kind of related to that. And it's something that I often hear, and probably many of you do. Why can't every government agency just say, cut their budget by 10%? And would that be effective if the president or Congress did that? Congress.
Well, again, like I said, that's still about 35% of the budget, government agencies. So, and actually this last budget year, every agency did have to find 5% worth of cuts in every agency. So, I mean, this is taking place, but the problem is, one, we're in a recession, so we have large budget deficits anyway because of the revenue problem, but also because you're talking about only 35% of the budget and a shrinking percent of the budget going forward because of the aging of the population and the healthcare costs.
And the interest costs.
And the interest costs.
Yeah,
so again, it really comes down to the big four things. You got healthcare costs, you got aging of the population, you have a tax code, and then 30% of the budget.
That's what I like best about the documentary and the graphics, because they showed it so plainly, these slices, and our seemingly simple solutions just don't hold up against those massive amounts.
Yeah, I think the graphics in this movie and in the first one are really a major addition to the budgetary debate. I don't say that because I helped with them, although I did help with them and I'm very proud of them. But I think Entertainment Weekly, when the first I.O.U.S.A. came out, reviewed the movie, said it was a good movie, and that if there was an Oscar for the best graphics, the movie should win, because presenting this information in a really accessible, easy to understand way is incredibly difficult. And the graphic designer, I think, did an amazing job. And one of the best things, if you get I.O.U.S.A. From Netflix, there's a special feature on the DVD that just has a graphic movie. It's basically 20 minutes of all the graphics from the movie strung one after the other. And it's certainly a lot more exciting than the PowerPoint slides I showed. So you should check that out.
Here's
Last
one
question, maybe?
Beg pardon?
Last question?
No.
What are we running? Are we running out of time?
Not quite, no.
Ooh, we got 10
Why
more
is-
minutes.
But close. Be patient. We're almost there. Why is the state with the highest taxes also the state with the greatest debt, i.e. California?
I'm not sure that it's the state with the highest taxes, or the greatest debt, actually. I think there are a couple things that...
Massachusetts, perhaps?
I'm not sure. I bet it depends where you live in California. Now, of course, California is, I think, something like the 8th largest economy in the world. So it's a pretty darn big state. But one of the things they have that I think is a fatal flaw that will ultimately have to be changed is they have this supermajority requirement to raise revenue. And that's combined with a ballot process that allows any special interest to get on the ballot pretty easily and impose additional spending doctrines on the legislature. So it really sets up a nearly impossible governing situation. And that has led to, as we all know, many financial and fiscal problems. And that's why supermajority requirements only serve to make hard choices even harder. And so if we want to look at ways out of these problems, I think eliminating supermajority requirements for hard choices is a very good step forward.
Very good. Here, this is one of my questions, but it's something I think is on the minds of many people, especially veterans. A large part of the solution is reducing defense spending. Yet, Defense Secretary Panetta and many worry that cutting too much will hollow out the military and make it not very effective to defend us. Is that something we should worry about?
We should always worry about having a good defense system and a strong army and a military that has benefits that keep them wanting to serve the country. I'm not a defense expert, but there has to be, in a budget that large as the Defense Department has, some areas worthy of cutting. So I think the prudent course would be to see what they can do to fit under the budget caps that they're faced with, and if it becomes a problem of true national security, then clearly this is one of those areas where we decide as a country we want a certain level of national security, and then we just have to be willing to pay for it with higher taxes.
Well, this may be raising politics, but it's just an opinion. When Congressman Barney Frank announced his intention to retire last week, he questioned, I saw an interview, he questioned whether we should be the world's cop, whether we should reduce our commitment to defend the world. That would make it easier to reduce our military costs.
It probably would make it easier to reduce our military costs. Whether it's wise or not, again, that's a political decision. But I should say that Congressman Frank was on a bipartisan commission that looked at the Defense Department and did something very similar to the President's Commission, looking for how much they could cut from the Defense Department and still maintain a very strong national defense. And they found about $1.1 trillion worth of cuts that could be made over 10 years. So to give you a perspective, that's probably $500 billion more than what the Defense Department is now facing with the debt ceiling and the trigger and the decline in spending on the war in Iraq. So There was a pretty hefty bipartisan majority on that commission of experts and former chiefs of the different military services. So if they felt 1.1 trillion was a reasonable amount to cut over 10 years, who am I to argue with that? So I think we, again, need to do as best we can to cut military spending, just like we should look at every other spending, and then just pay for what we feel we need.
Are you familiar with a book called Aftershock by David Wiedemeyer?
No.
He wrote a book before the crash that predicted what was going to happen, and now he's come out with a sequel that predicts 2 more bubbles to burst, our country's debt bubble and the European crisis that's happening now with them that's going to pull us down. And he says that's going to lead to huge inflation, but I think you say that we don't have to worry about inflation for several years.
I think the best economic analysis out there that's bipartisan or nonpartisan, I should say, is that inflation just won't be a problem as long as unemployment is as high as it is. If you look at regular economic theory, and Dr. Witham, my economist who taught me economics when I was a sophomore in high school, who is here, would probably agree that you get high inflation when you have a tight labor market and have to raise labor costs, and then that causes the price of goods to go up. With 8 or 9% unemployment, we do not have to worry about that. And if you look at what the Congressional Budget Office projects for unemployment levels, we don't get down to 6% unemployment until 2016 or 2017, which is really an economic tragedy that we really haven't talked that much about. So I think over the short term, inflation is not anywhere close to being our largest problem.
Well, this will be the last question, and it has to do with that. What will it take? Is there some move or series of moves that it would take to goose the economy and get people back to work, to create those jobs?
I think this is a good question to end on, because probably the most frustrating thing for people concerned about the federal budget over the last year to 2 years has been this idea that you cannot, that you have to choose between responsible fiscal policy or between putting money into the economy over the short term to get it going. And we're having that debate again right now with the payroll tax holiday. And I think, again, it is very clear that spending money now to help the economy and get us out of this unemployment problem is a very good thing to do, because we need to grow the economy. And it becomes even more effective if you do it with some sort of long-term fiscal discipline. Not short-term fiscal discipline, long-term fiscal discipline. So in effect, you have to be irresponsible in the short term, but if you pair that irresponsibility with responsibility over the long term, it makes it even more of a powerful economic stimulus. And so we've been debating, for 6 months, really, the debt ceiling and where to cut spending. And all of that is really focused on the short term. And what we've talked about primarily are these long-term challenges of healthcare, aging, mandatory spending programs. So what the super committee had on its plate, and actually what the Bowles-Simpson Commission and all the other bipartisan commissions recommended they do, was over the short term, you invest a little in infrastructure, you have the payroll tax holiday, you do some things over the short term to get money flowing in the economy again. And then you pair that with these long-term reforms that we all know are needed. And if you look at the political dynamic, this actually opens up a very easy compromise, because predominantly Republicans are concerned about the debt and want to trim our long-term entitlement programs. Democrats want to protect them, but Democrats also want to goose the economy in the short term. And so you really had this wonderful coalition that could have gotten together to compromise on something that went part of the way towards long-term responsibility, and also at least part of the way towards getting the economy going in the short term. And we call this at Concord being able to walk and chew gum at the same time. There's no reason why we cannot do that. It is better to do that than to just pick one or the other, even from Concord saying fiscal responsibility is not the only thing. It's not the be-all, end-all of budget policy. We need to get the economy going because ultimately the entire goal is to have a growing economy. So if you grow the economy over the short term and pair that with these long-term fiscal responsibility choices that will help grow the economy over the long term, we're just made much better off. And it is absolutely mind-boggling that we have not been able to do that. So that is my one area of pessimism, really, that it's just incredibly disappointing. And the media actually bears some responsibility for this as well, that the media only seems to focus on one debate and not both debates at the same time. But this is really something that we need to focus on. And it's still not too late because, like I said, we're looking at high levels of unemployment for many, many years still, even assuming the economy continues on the current trajectory where it's kind of recovering, but not rapidly. So we can do something about the short-term economy, and that can still be fiscally responsible.
It seems like a great note to end on. I'm sorry that I didn't get to all of your questions. I can promise you that this problem isn't going away, and we'll probably do something on this in the future, maybe later in the year or something like that, 9 months, 10 months from now. I don't know about you, but I feel much more enlightened and optimistic after hearing Dr. Gordon, and I'd like to ask you to thank him for this information. And we want to remind you to come up in for our next program on January 11th. We're going to be debating the future of energy, especially nuclear energy, and whether our lawmakers get it. And again, thanks to our co-sponsors, the WSF, Bright House, and the St. Petersburg Times. Good night, and thank you for coming.